Chat's open. Right, okay.
And we are live on YouTube, and I'm going to let people in. Okay,
Randy, make sure that you give me a lead in, okay?
we're starting, Chris.
Okay.
Got,
Okay,
if you're not in, try getting in.
welcome everybody. This is the Montgomery County Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're just getting started. Just open the doors. Takes a few minutes to let people in. Welcome. You're just joining us. This is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Takes a couple minutes to let people in the door. We're just getting started. Please be patient. We'll be with you all shortly. I think I want to figure out how to go back to having that house music as we let people in, to figure that out again. A little worried about my technical skills. Last time it didn't work out so well.
I can hum.
No. No.
Okay.
I'll give you a tutorial later, Matt.
All right, Kids Bop just ended in the other room. You just missed it. I would have turned it up.
Oh, we could do
All right.
Kids Pop. There you go.
This is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're letting people in the door. That takes a few minutes on Zoom. Welcome, everybody. Give it another 30 seconds and we'll get started.
And they're all.
Okay, let's begin. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Losack. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. Welcome to everybody. This is our first town hall of the month of March. We have another one, I believe, on the 25th. Hang on. The 22nd will be our next one. Tonight, we're going to have a discussion, perhaps not as long as 90 minutes, but it might go that long depending on your questions and concerns. But we're going to talk about current legislation that is pending. We had hoped to have a couple of our board members, Delegate Janelle Wilkins and Delegate Vaughn Stewart, but as you might expect, they are actually in session passing legislation as we speak in Annapolis. They had hoped to join us, but are actually doing their jobs. So we're going to pick up the slack for them and describe a couple of areas of importance in terms of legislation. Let me also just give some instructions tonight, as always. If you have questions or concerns about anything having to do with the legislation that we're talking about, your own issues as renters rights, questions about resources that are available to you, questions about enforcing your rights, we can answer those questions. Just put them in the chat. And our staff will be monitoring the chat and see that we get to those questions. With us tonight is, in addition to our staff, is my two board members, the Brandy Brooks, who's calling in from I'm not sure where, but let's just say somewhere in the state of Maryland, and Chris Perry, who's calling in from his apartment, our vice chair of our board. So for those of you who have not heard yet, we had the council accepted Sorry, yes, Pat,
I'm-
what?
I'm Pat Beckham and I
Oh, I'm
also
sorry.
work
Let me introduce my
as
staff.
well as
Pat
my
Beckham,
Yes,
Malek Demir, and David Mullins.
thank you.
Never neglect the staff. Thank you, Pat. So in the last week, on Tuesday, the Montgomery County Council accepted two bills to consider for rent stabilization. One is called the Home Act, and one is called the Anti-Rent Gouging Bill, to paraphrase, I think. It has wide differences. One bill, the Home Act, which the lead sponsors are Kristen Mink and Will Jawando, council members, and it is supported by the county executive. That is intended to put a cap on rents at 3%. It will allow for new investment in new properties and exempting new invested properties for a period of time so that they can make their money back. But by and large, it has the most, as we see it now, protection for renters across the county. A second bill intends to have the rents capped at 8% plus the consumer price index for urban areas. So that would be 8% plus what the CPI is right now, which is 6.4% in this region. So we're talking about 14+% increase. Many people believe that that is not a anti-rent gouging, but actually legitimizing rent gouging. It also allows for the exemptions for small landlords and exemptions for properties built in the last 15 years. So they're widely different. I will say, knowing this council and knowing all of the council members, that we believe that we have a very thoughtful council. We know that some of them have some interests in various industries and are more supportive of different constituencies than we are. But we believe that they're thoughtful and considerate. And this conversation is just beginning. The bills were introduced yesterday. There will be a hearing at the end of March. And then the bill will go to the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee, which is chaired by Councilmember Friedson. I should say the other bill is co-sponsored by Councilmember Andrew Friedson and Councilmember Natalie Fanny Gonzalez, and has 6 members so far that support that bill. So majority support the higher increase bill, but as I say, it's early days. We expect that the council will deliberate on the budget between now and May when they pass the budget, before they even get around to discussing what the ultimate bill will be, what amendments there might be to the bills, and what the final form of a rent stabilization bill will look like, if indeed they decide to go forward with a rent stabilization bill and have a vote. But to talk about housing in general and how important that is, let me introduce our board member, Brandy Brooks, to say a little bit on a higher level about what housing means to our communities. Brandy?
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. And thanks to all of you for being here for our town hall this evening. This is a really important topic for all of us as the Renters Alliance board and staff, and certainly for many, many members of our community. As we recall, and as we talk about a lot here at the Renters Alliance, nearly 40% of Montgomery County residents live in rental housing. So this impacts hundreds of thousands of people in our community. And as the Renters Alliance, we have a very strong investment in making sure that the legislation that ultimately passes this council is our policies that really support the rights and the well-being and the stability of those of us who live in renter housing. And it's important for us to remember that housing isn't just any other commodity. It's not just any other good or service. When we talk about the fact that housing is a human right, what we're really referring to is the fact that stable, quality, affordable housing is central to a community's health, is central to the health of the people who make homes here in our county. And our welfare and our prosperity are dependent on people having stable places to live. And so as we think about what rent stabilization should mean and why rent stabilization is important, it's about balancing the needs of a landlord, yes, to run a business, to be able to maintain their business, to do the things that they need to do to maintain their properties, but also the recognition that for anyone who enters into the business of housing, that there's an expectation that they need to accept the responsibility that that entails to make sure that the way that they run their property and the way that we set rents and costs associated with housing actually supports that community health and welfare and prosperity that housing is central to. I also want to remind us as we enter into this conversation that the idea of rent stabilization is actually not new. It's not a new policy at all in the United States. It's something that was in fact very popular in the 50s and 60s, especially when you look at ways that we across the country were seeking to grow out communities, and that there was a recognition that there needed to be some way to stabilize the cost of housing for people in renter housing. We began to back away from that perspective in the 80s, really with the advent of this the idea of trickle down economics, the idea that if you just made everything good for folks at the top, that would somehow eventually trickle down to all of us. We know very firmly, people knew at the time, and we have proved it again by testing this for more than 50 years, that that's not the way the world works.
Right.
And so we want to make sure that we are not continuing to follow policy that says, so long as you take care of folks at the top, that the rest of us will somehow end up being fine. We know that doesn't work in general. We certainly know that that doesn't work in housing. And so what we want to do here in Montgomery County is be able to follow the trend and the leadership of jurisdictions all across the country that have reclaimed rent stabilization as a way to ensure housing stabilization across the board for their communities. There are more than 180 jurisdictions across the country that use rent stabilization as a key tool in their community housing arsenal. And that includes jurisdictions here in Maryland. And we're really excited about the way that Prince George's County, the way that cities like Laurel and Mount Rainier have again reclaimed this as a tool and said, we want to make sure that as we go forward, we are protecting the rights of everyone in our communities to be in stable housing. And we recognize that that human right is also central to our collective well-being as a county, as cities, and quite honestly, when we think about it, across the country. And so again, I'm excited about the opportunity that we're going to have. As Matt mentioned, there's going to be months of conversation around this. So we are at the beginning, and what we want to do, as we always do in the Renters Alliance, is start by grounding with you all, the members of our community, our renters, our supporters of renters' rights, on what these bills are about, on the perspective that we are seeing and the perspectives that we want to take into these conversations, and where we want you to help partner with us on these conversations to make sure that as we talk with the county council members, that we're really letting them know about the clear impacts of this on the lives of that 40% of people in our county, and supporting them to make really good decisions that protect the overall well-being of our community. So again, I'm looking forward to hearing from other folks who've been part of the introductory pieces of this legislation. And I'm going to hand it back over to Matt to give us an overview of the bills.
Okay. I'm not going to get too much into detail. I put the links into the chat for both bills, and I urge everyone to take a close read at it. One of the reasons why we don't want to get too much into details, because on Monday, the Renters Alliance will host a in-person community meeting at the Silver Spring Civic Center from 6 to 8 p.m. And that discussion will include County Executive Mark Elrich, County Council members Will Jawando and Kate Stewart, as well as our board chair, William Roberts, Professor Michael Bodakin from the University of Maryland, who's an expert on housing policy. And this is intended to be a good faith discussion. We invited pretty much the co-sponsors of the anti-rent gouging bill, council members Friedson and Fanny Gonzalez, they declined. But we are looking for a good faith discussion with folks who have criticisms about rent stabilization. There's nothing that shouldn't be on the table. We don't want anybody who has a valid criticism or even one that's not valid, but because they don't understand, not to have an opportunity to learn about this policy, its history, whether there are unintended consequences, whether we have to balance consequences of implementing this versus the consequences of not implementing this. So it's important that we get all on the same page. Fortunately, I say fortunately because many people have already been priced out of their homes in our region. We are seeing double-digit skyrocketing rents, and we are seeing the reality of a forced migration of working and low-income families from our community. We're seeing a migration of our workforce. We are seeing incredible pressure and anxiety and destabilization of senior citizens' homes and people who are on fixed income. So there is a crisis going on, to be sure. However, from a legislative process standpoint and a public policy standpoint, we have some time to consider this, and it's time that we do it. We've brought this up for years. When we first formed the Renters Alliance back in 2010, after 2 years of working on the tenants work group, which recommended rent stabilization when it issued its report in 2010, every year. And when we first started this, the council literally laughed in my face and said, we're never going to pass rent stabilization around here, to actually passing the first renter protection bill in half a century in 2016, to slowly but surely coming around to recognizing that housing was important to the health, welfare, and prosperity of our communities. And unfortunately, coinciding that understanding with a housing crisis. So that was even made more stark by the pandemic. So here we are. And if you all have any questions about rent stabilization or about your situation, please put them in the chat. We'll get to them. I also want to welcome our fellow board member, Josh Fisher, who's able to join us as well. He's also our treasurer, so he likes to make sure our money's being spent the way we say we're spending it. So welcome, Josh. Glad to have you. Staff, is there any questions in the chat that we should be getting to?
So even though we have a focused topic here, it's also an open forum. And I think someone is bringing up a question about Arrive. It's okay to tackle that one.
Yeah, we will. Let's get to that one after we finish this particular topic, but definitely.
Okay, it's clear.
Okay. All right, then let me say that rent stabilization is on the agenda. It is the top discussion in Montgomery County at the moment. But we also have, Pat, did you want to say something quick?
No, you go ahead.
On the state level, we have legislation that is also under consideration. The Renters Alliance is the leading co-founder of Renters United Maryland. We formed that some years ago, I forgot when, but we formed it in order to get those organizations that work on legislation in Annapolis to work together in a coordinated way. And we've been doing this for several years. And there is some legislation that can only be passed at the state level. For example, anything having to do with eviction law. Rent stabilization can be passed on the local level. And we saw it passed just recently in Mount Rainier, in Prince George's County, and in Laurel. We also know that it has been enacted in 180 jurisdictions around the country, which is a real comeback for rent stabilization because we're not alone in what we're seeing in housing destabilization. And so other communities are acting to protect renters now, as they should, all over the place. So hopefully, in an ironic way, Montgomery County tended to be the leading progressive or community in the state, and now we're behind Prince George's County, so we've got to catch up. But at the state level, there are several bills under consideration, and I'm going to go to the two bills that are our board members' bills. The first one is called the Tenant Justice Act, and that was put forward by Delegate Vaughn Stewart. When a tenant has a case in an apartment building where they have a complaint and they want to take that complaint to court, right now the law requires that each tenant file on his or her own behalf a single case. And what the Tenant Justice Act intends to do, if it were to pass, would allow tenants in a building to collectively file a case in court, like a union. So if you're working for a company, instead of having individual complaints, you could go to the union and the union could act collectively on your behalf. So a tenants association could actually file saying, the leaky faucet in your apartment is also in 20 apartments in this building, and now we can file together. My staff guy, David Mullins, who studies this a little bit, might have a better take. David, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I was just going to add that this one in particular, I haven't been following too closely, but I think it's the Tenant Safety Act now. And I did want to just put in the current link to, if anybody wants to take a look at the bill, it's there. But yeah, no, I mean, it's just that's my understanding, is that it's a faster path to that collective action when it comes to rent escrow. Yeah.
And of course, we support it and submit legislation for it. There's also a bill that might actually pass this year. It came close last year. It passed both the House and the Senate, but was vetoed or is not signed by the governor, the previous governor. So hopefully this year we might have a more favorable response, but it's a law that would require or forbid, I should say, prohibit a landlord from using the courts to go after tenants if they're not licensed. It's a belief that if you're going to operate, you have to, we have an expectation in Montgomery County and certainly in other jurisdictions around the state, that if you're going to be a landlord, you have to be up to code. You have to operate a safe and secure environment for someone to live, and you have to make repairs and so on. And that requires keeping up, if you're doing that, and having a license to do so. If you don't have a license and then you sue your tenants for failure to pay rent or something else, you shouldn't be allowed to use the publicly supported court system or any other enforcement mechanism if you yourself are not keeping up your end of the bargain. So that bill is very close to passing, and obviously we support it. Last year, it was the lead sponsor was Senator Shelley Heddleman out of Baltimore, and I'm not sure who the co-sponsors are this year, probably Senator Heddleman again, but obviously that's something that we support as well. Now, the bigger kahuna that we've been working on for quite some time is just cause eviction protection. Now, just cause eviction protection, for those who don't know what it is, simply says that a landlord must renew your lease absent a just cause. Right now in the state of Maryland, with 60 days notice toward the end of your lease, a landlord could say they're not going to renew the lease. They don't have to state why. And then if you stay a day longer than the lease term, the landlord can file in court to have you evicted for tenant holding over. That is, a tenant holding over one more day beyond the term of your lease. Unfortunately, there's no defense against that unless you could prove a nefarious intent, which is just about impossible for a tenant. You may know that it's for racial discrimination, or you may know because you're trying to form a tenants association, or because you've complained about rats or mold or vermin, or you've complained about some other building maintenance condition. But unless you can, without the landlord having to state the reason, there is no way to tell what the landlord's motivation is, and the judge only wants to know that they have a right to possess the property, provided they gave you 60 days notice. So we have seen tenants from the wealthier side of the economic spectrum to the lower income side of the economic spectrum, absolutely petrified of losing their homes for fear, for speaking up for promised or required services on their rights, simply because the landlord can evict them. We've seen tenants who have been in apartment buildings for 5, 10, 20 years, who are afraid each year at each lease term that they might lose their homes. So first, a few years ago, way back when Sheila Hickson was representing us, she put in for a just cause bill that would have made just cause the law of the land throughout the state of Maryland. It didn't make it to a vote in the committee. We did it each year. We testified each year. Janelle Wilkins joined our board some years ago, and she took this up after she became a state delegate. First, she proposed it statewide, as Sheila Hickson had. Then she proposed it as local enabling for just Montgomery County. And it got more support at that time. And for the first time, Montgomery County, which didn't support it originally, then politics changed. The council actually decided to support it. Mark Elrich became county executive, and he supported it. And the delegation included more and more new delegates who were in support. And so we got the vast majority of the state delegation to support it. So that was unprecedented. But as expected, it got to the Environment and Transportation Committee, and whose chair is Kumar Barve, who opposes it, even though he's from Montgomery County as well. And so that did not make it out of committee. The next year, that was last year, Delegate Wilkins decided that what would be more effective would be to create a local enabling bill. And what that is it simply says that each jurisdiction, if the bill were to pass, each jurisdiction could on their own pass rent stabilization or not, and in any form that they want. So most rent just cause eviction bills include a number of things. Obviously, you can evict somebody for any justifiable reason that we know of. If you don't pay your rent, or you are abusing the property, or breaking the law, or creating a danger to other tenants, or becoming a substantial nuisance in such a way that any Judge Judy would agree is you really can't stay here any longer if you keep behaving like that. All of those are listed in a just cause, most just cause protection legislation. In addition, there are some just cause reasons that are business related. For example, if you're a small landlord and you decide you're not going to rent anymore, you're going to take the apartment off the market. Well, that would be a just cause, provided you do it in good faith, not just to get rid of a tenant and then temporarily and then put it back on the market. Or you're a small landlord and you want to allow your senior citizen mother to move in upstairs in the apartment, one apartment that you have. That would be a just cause reason. Another reason, which might apply more to larger landlords, would be that you're going to renovate the building and make a whole bunch of apartments uninhabitable for an extended period of time. So provided you give proper notice to tenants, that would be another just cause reason. However, this bill doesn't say what the just cause legislation would look like in any jurisdiction. It says that the local jurisdiction can determine whether to pass just cause or not, and what it would look like. Consequently, strategically, because it was giving power to the local jurisdictions, it got lots of support. So not only did we have County Executive Elrich and the mayor of Baltimore and representatives from Prince George's County and the Maryland Association of Counties and scores of advocacy organizations, as well as even more scores of renters urging its support, it really started to pick up steam. But again, last year it was blocked by Delegate Kumar Barve. This year, we're in a similar situation, except that not only do we have the same amount of support and more in the House, but we also have a crossover bill in the Senate. And that bill was lead sponsor to Delegate Wilkins' bill in the House is Senator Anthony Muse of Prince George's County. And so yesterday we had a full judicial proceedings hearing where we heard from lots of tenants and lots of advocacy organizations. And one of those tenants was the vice chair of our board, Chris Perry, who has his own story to tell. Chris, you want to tell us what you were saying yesterday?
Yeah, Matt, I do. Give me a second here. basically Matt and I and several advocates for just cause eviction legislation visited our elected representatives at the Annapolis State Capitol yesterday, March 7th, to support Senate Bill 504. Now, 504 is a bill being heard by State Senator Will Smith's Judicial Proceedings Review Committee, otherwise known as JPR. Senator Smith and Vice Chair Jeff Waldstreicher heard testimony from the Renters Alliance and other supporters of just cause protections for Maryland renters. Now, as Matt just explained to you, just cause protection, basically, as Maryland law is currently written, a landlord can evict a tenant with just 60 days notice at the end of a rental lease and give no reason whatsoever about why the tenant is being turned out of his or her home. All the landlord has to do is tell the court the tenant is holding over from the previous lease. Doesn't matter how long you've lived in your apartment, 1 year, 5 years, or even longer. All the landlord has to do is not issue you an invitation to extend the lease. Now, the Landlords Association, one of them is called the Apartment Owners and Builders Association, or AOBA, say that since they own the apartment, they ought to be able to do anything they want with it, kind of like selling a car or a TV set or anything else that can be rented out. But here's the difference. If you take back a car that someone has rented from you, you don't force them to remove all the furniture, clothes, appliances, and move them from someplace else with 60 days notice. Without a just cause protection, a landlord can do exactly that. And there's no legal defense you have. 60 days later, the sheriff can show up at your front door and toss your belongings out in the street. Now, the landlords say they ought to be able to kick out someone who is a nuisance, loud music, barking dogs, et cetera, et cetera. That annoys the neighbors, or someone who is doing something illegal in their apartment or who is damaging the apartment. But here's the thing. When you sign a lease on your apartment, you basically give the landlord the right to evict you for cause, or what's called a breach of lease. This new bill doesn't remove any of those protections. What it does do is oblige the landlord to tell you and a court in writing why you're being asked to leave. The court doesn't agree that you've done what the landlord alleges, you get to stay in your apartment as long as you keep the conditions of the original lease and pay the rent. Now, yesterday, we went to Annapolis to advocate to Senator Smith's committee that you, the tenant, should have the right to stay in your apartment or leased house or whatever, unless the landlord can show a just legally defined cause why you should have to leave. That's what we went over there to do yesterday. And honestly, I think we did a pretty good job of convincing the JPR committee of the merits of this latest version of just cause protections.
Well, and I think, Chris, some of your remarks, in addition to what the bill was, and let me just say a couple things, again, reminding the bill was not to pass just cause, it was to pass permission by the state to allow the local jurisdictions to pass it if they so choose, because eviction law is state law and state court law. And so it cannot be enacted by a local jurisdiction without the legislature passing legally permission to do so. So just keep that in mind. But Chris, I was your remarks regarding your personal situation, I thought were interesting because you're a veteran and you and your wife are senior citizens, and my sense was that moving would not be an easy thing for you or any other senior citizen.
No, of course it wouldn't. And as I pointed out in my testimony, my wife and I both were vocal about not receiving required services, maintenance, et cetera, But like every other renter in the state of Maryland, if we make noise, if we complain, we stand the possibility of being called a problem tenant and evicted, during our next lease cycle. And that's wrong.
It's absolutely wrong. We saw at Flower Branch Apartments, which many of you all might remember from some years ago, where there was a terrible explosion that killed 7 tenants, 2 of them children, due to a gas explosion. Now, we had been working with Flower Branch tenants and we still work with tenants in the Long Branch area, but many of them had told us that they had made complaints to management and were told by management at that time frequently that if they kept complaining about mice or sometimes the smell of gas, or other issues in their apartment communities that they might face eviction. And so what happens in communities like that is that people get quiet. There is a chilling effect that says, better to keep your mouth shut and not say anything at all because you could lose your home. We have seen this actually in wealthy apartment communities as well. There's some buildings in Bethesda where people paying $3,000, $7,000 a month, $8,000 or more for an apartment, which I'm looking forward to one day being able to afford. But those people who are retired judges and diplomats and lawyers and executives they moved in after they retired, and they moved in when they were in their 70s and now in their 80s. And they cannot imagine what it would be like if they had to move. They sold the house, they moved in lock, stock, and barrel into an apartment, not as a temporary residence, but as their last home to live quietly and in peace. And being forced to move would be absolutely overwhelming, potentially increasing their anxiety, increasing health issues. And really, they just didn't know where they would go. Now, it's true, if they have some more money, they might have more options than someone on the lower end of the economic scale, but it is catastrophic for anyone to be forced out of their home like that, and especially for senior citizens. So I always say, if that's where they are on the upper end of the economic spectrum, you can only imagine how threatening it is for middle and lower income families. Pat, you're in a situation where you're not rich, you're not poor, but you're not rich either. And I know you're concerned also about your housing. Do you want to give us some idea of your remarks too?
Well, like everyone else, I'm concerned. I sold my home in Prince George's County and moved to Montgomery County to be closer to my 4 sisters. And I had not realized that I could be evicted for no cause. So it's actually terrifying to think you can be put out of your home for no reason. There were a lot of people giving stories. I think these 2 pieces of legislation, rent stabilization and for just cause, are very important. And I just want to say before I move on, is everybody that can hear me need to mobilize now. You need to get out in your communities, talk to your community leaders, the legislators, the pastors of your church. This is important. We need to get this legislation passed. And the only way we can do it is get together, advocate, and fight for, because these bills not only are unfair, they are also disruptive for the community as a whole. Mm-hmm. People don't want to sit in their houses thinking, I wonder if I'm going to get a notice today saying I must move. Mm-hmm. And you're doing what you're supposed to. So this is important. We need to really move on these 2 pieces of legislation. Mm-hmm.
And Pat, we're proud to remind people that you are somebody who was a ICU nurse and somebody who worked in healthcare your whole life, and you're entitled to have a peaceful and secure retirement. David Mullins, who's on my staff, had to stay home with the kids yesterday, but he knows what his wife, Lindsay, was reporting. And I don't know if Lindsay's there. Maybe she can tell us a little about her testimony, or you can tell us what she said.
She's standing right here, but now she's backing away. But no, yeah, it's for real. It's kind of what I want to mention them in my work self. We do see a lot of just that landlords are very aware of the law, and that, in conversations would be very normal to give a reason that you're not renewing someone's lease. They just know to stay quiet and not say anything. And it's very weird to see, but also clearly they know that they don't need to, and that's the way to get out, easier than the law really intends. And yeah, we've been kept here personally, month to month for a long time. We wanted to renew and just weren't allowed, but luckily we've been allowed to stay there in that. But now I've been offered a very high increase. So, these issues are certainly tied together. But one thing that Lindsay mentioned that we've found is our apartment complex is large, but there's also happened to be no other rental places that go to the school where our son goes. So it's everyone here that has kids in school. It's a certain change in schools if you're not renewed here, which the management here didn't really seem aware of when I brought it up. These things are not always thought through all the way, how that affects everyone around them, including the teachers then.
Yeah, I think Lindsay said, what was it, like 40% of your building are
Oh, well, no, 40% of the student body at the elementary school,
right,
from just our garden complex here. Yeah.
right. Well, what people are coming to realize is that housing instability obviously has a humanitarian cost on people. It increases their anxiety. Could be a disaster for people to lose their belongings if they're evicted, if they don't know where to go. It could be an emotional disaster, having to go from couch to couch or to a family's home that really can't have more than their own family in that home, or having to move home with parents, or having to move into a homeless shelter, or having to move farther away from your job so that you have to travel great distances just in order to work. So housing instability obviously has a humanitarian impact, but there's a lot of things that people don't think about that also come along with that impact. And that includes the financial costs to all of us. When we have children, we're a wealthy county, so we're very lucky in some regards. We have a $6 billion budget. That's bigger than most towns in the United States. But about half of our budget goes to our school system. And we put that money, our taxes, into the school system. I mean, forget the humanitarian part, forget our hearts, forget our compassion, but we put money into the school system to produce tax-paying, productive citizens. And if kids don't do as well in school, if their academic achievement is impacted, they're not going to do as well. Plus, some kids will really not do well. And if they really don't do well, we see an increase in truancy, we see an increase in crime rates, we see an increase in other social problems that we're all going to pay for. Financially, we're going to pay for it. We also see what happens when the healthcare costs of more and more people who are suffering because their housing is not stable, anxiety, physical problems, mental problems. We are seeing an uptick in domestic violence and abuse in people who are living in unstable homes. We're seeing more and more seniors having to avail themselves of health care that they wouldn't normally have had to pursue because they're worried all the time. We're also seeing what happens when people don't feel permanent. We as renters know we're not living, as I think Pat Beckham once said, these are not Airbnbs or hotel rooms. These are our homes. These are permanent homes. But we're worried year to year that we may be evicted. And when you have that in the back of your mind, you don't go out into the community and buy things that a permanent household would buy. And so people invest differently when they feel impermanent. So there's money that is not being, that we're not as prosperous as we could be, and we're more expensive than we should be because housing is unstable. So if you don't have a heart, you don't care what happens to people, and you say, hey, you can't afford your home, goodbye, just bear in mind that you're also going to be paying a price for that. So something to keep in mind. Josh, did you want to add something to our discussion since you've joined us?
Yeah. So at the rally yesterday at
The press conference.
The press conference, right, at the county council, I struck up a very interesting conversation with a resident that was there who was displaced from her home due to her rent being increased, and now she was forced to live in a shelter, and now she's living in a shelter, moving from shelter to shelter or place to place, not knowing where she's going to sleep that night because the rent is, she's employed and she earns an income, but the rent is just so substantial that she was unable to afford it, and now she's displaced. So It was a true story that kind of hit home with me, and it's real. So that's my 2 cents, Matt.
I know there's some people on this call that I can see who've joined us. I'm not going to say your names, but I know that in many cases where we've seen a tenant holding over or 60-day notice, we know that there is nefarious intent, that it's retaliatory. And in one case, I remember, because we strategically got the property manager to admit what they were doing, but they were trying to evict the tenants, long-term tenants, senior citizens, blaming without any reason at all. When we asked them what the real reason was, they admitted that they thought that the tenants had brought in bed bugs into the building, but they left out that there were lots of other tenants in the building that also had bed bugs, and therefore it was impossible and wrong to accuse any one tenant of having bed bugs. And what the landlord was really trying to do was to not have to exterminate and pay the price that they're responsible for eliminating vermin, bed bugs, cockroaches, and the rest in the building. We fought that back and got them stable again. But we know behind all of this is usually something retaliatory or some neglect of the landlord refusing to do what they're supposed to do, and just easier to get rid of the tenants. And of course, again, have power over tenants to keep them quiet. Questions in the chat? Have we gotten through both of these issues pretty much? And can we circle back around to other issues?
Well, one thing I'll note is there, if you want to rewind a minute, there was a policy question, economic, about the stabilization. But I've been fielding some questions on rent relief. Actually, has been in rental assistance options have been in the chat a little bit. And one tie-in I do want to offer up is that, as hard as retaliation is to prove, as Matt's pointing out, we always do want to remind people there are defenses, if limited as they are, to some of these things. There are legal resources available if you end up in court, free legal services if you end up in court for tenant holding over. And then also, for those of you that may have gotten COVID rent relief, letters were sent to landlords saying that you will renew this person's lease too. And we've heard mixed results of holding landlords to that. But I just kind of wanted to drop a technical note here about places we already see this kind of protection, especially because as I watched those hearings online, I kept hearing pushback on economics about if we have just cause, the landlord's going to be afraid to do business here. But I really want to remind people we already have it in tons of buildings here. Anyone that is a low income housing tax credit building, any of our developers that took advantage of that, they agreed to just cause protection in those buildings. So, if you have individual questions about that, whether your building might have that protection already under federal law, let us know. But that is also just the case. We already see it in practice, and sure enough, still plenty of business being done here that we see.
Yeah, as well as many states have it. So it's working well throughout the country.
So on one question that relates to the two topics of just cause and rent stabilization, I see what has been the impact in Tacoma Park. Well, the landlords will argue that the impact has been no one wants to build in Tacoma Park. That wherever you have your rent stabilization, there'll be no new investment. This is, we know from research that's been done in many places across the country, that this is not true. That the reasons why landlords build or developers build and don't build has very little to do with the amount of renter protections enacted in those regions. For example, in Washington, D.C., and in New York City and in San Francisco that have just cause eviction protection as well as rent stabilization, you have some of the most robust investment in rental housing in the world. You also have the most valuable renter stocks in the world. And if there's any place to build an apartment building, they are building one. Likewise, if you go to Baltimore City or to Cleveland or to Richmond, where they have very few renter protections, they also have miles of blight and available apartments that are boarded up. So one of the issues is that one thing has nothing to do with the other. The reason why people invest in building apartment buildings in these places is because there's money to be made. This is where there are high-paying jobs and a market that makes rental apartments valuable. So in Tacoma Park, why hasn't there been building? Well, ask Jamie Raskin, because they'd have to tear down his house in order for that to happen. There is no available space, as what the former mayor of Tacoma Park told me the other day when this argument came forward. Said, where are you going to build any housing? One of the statistics that sort of it's thrown out there about, why isn't there more building? Well, first of all, you don't build an apartment building overnight. It takes years of planning and permitting and then actually putting a shovel in the ground. But the available land in the 1960s and the price of that land is very different from what it is today. And so where Montgomery County in the 60s was a house and garden community with lots of land, not a whole lot of development in a lot of places. One could get acres of land to build developments on a lot cheaper, and there was a lot more available. There's much less available now, and the price of property has gone up high. If you go to Tacoma Park, where are you going to build? So you'd have to actually have a piece of land that you can afford, and you'd actually have to have the land in the first place. So Tacoma Park is largely a house and garden. It's largely saturated. Wherever there could be an apartment building, there is one. So the correlation of if you have rent stabilization, people won't build there. Well, that's not the whole story. There are other elements to why people build and why they do not. Likewise, people said, if you have just cause in the state of Maryland and you have, rent stabilization enacted in all these places, we'll have a housing shortage and a housing crisis. Well, we already have one. Apparently that didn't matter. We have a housing shortage. That is, there aren't enough choices for people. There's not enough competition to bring prices down. That is a pre-existing condition. So we hope to get into this a little bit on Monday with a 2-hour forum with experts on this, pro and against. We have invited the Landlords Association to our event on Monday. We'll see if they come. We hope that they do. We want responsible, in-depth conversations about housing policy, and we want to address some of these objections and make sure that everybody's well informed as we head into these more serious considerations of actual legislation. Okay, what else is out there that we should be talking about? I know there was a question about Arrive. I have a whole soliloquy on that. What else is out there, Malek?
Well, go ahead, Pat.
No, I just wanted to say there was a question about Arrive and pretty much what we are doing, meaning Renters Alliance. And we
I'll get to that in just a moment, Pat. I'm going to go to the other ones.
Good.
I honestly, I think we've covered everything. I've put in 3 times the information for Monday's community forum. So everybody has that.
We have some questions on what are available rental assistance. So let me go through a couple of things. One, everybody should know the COVID rent relief program closed January 13th. They are still working through the existing applications. If you're still waiting, they are still prioritizing those who are facing imminent eviction. Those that, if you've been accepted, your application is in, and you were 2 months behind in your rent as of June 30th, then they are working through those applications. But your priority, unfortunately, will have to be when you receive a court summons and, unfortunately, possibly a red and white notice that says your eviction is imminent from the sheriff's office. We oppose that process, but that is the county's process. And so that's the way they're prioritizing. Hopefully, they'll be able to get through some of these applications before you end up in crisis, but that's the way they're working through. There was something called the Pulse report. If one of you all could pull that up and put that in the chat. The latest report will say how many applications are remaining and how much funds have been given out. Other resources available to tenants. If you are facing eviction and you do not qualify for the COVID rent relief funds, which was specifically a federal government program that went out to the states and then to the local jurisdictions for people who were impacted by COVID. So if it wasn't for those reasons, you will not qualify. You have to have had COVID, have to have been laid off because of COVID, after taking care of somebody who has COVID. It has to be related to COVID. If that does not apply to you, and you lost your job for some other reason, or your revenue for some other reason, there is a program in the county with Health and Human Services called Services to End and Prevent Homelessness. They have some funds available, not what the COVID rent relief program had, but a few $1,000s, not to just to give to you, but to pay for things like a security deposit in another location, storage of your belongings, moving expenses. And we urge you to call 311 and ask for services to end and prevent homelessness. Interfaith Works, which is a partner of the Renters Alliance, has an emergency assistance coalition. I'm on the board. And that is a coalition of a number of small charities that have a small amount of money to give to people who are facing specific hardships, like if you don't have your utility money, or something happens where you need a few $100s here or there. And I would urge you to look at Interfaith Works. I think it's interfaithworks.org, and find their resources available to you. Obviously, there's also other resources on the Montgomery County website for food assistance and for utility assistance. There's and also on the State of Maryland website, the Department of Housing and Community Development, also under new leadership, that has other resources available to tenants. And if you can't find what you're looking for any of that, just email us at info@rentersalliance.org, and one of us will get back to you with the specific information about resources available to you. Also, we spend a lot of time, the majority of our time, working with individual tenants that have issues with their landlord or their housing. So we're available to do that. We are an independent nonprofit. We don't have the force of law behind us, but we know what's going on and what the laws are generally. We're not lawyers, but we know what the laws are generally. And we can advise you what to do. And in some cases, we can guide you to the enforcement mechanisms of the county, whether that be code or the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, or in some cases to the Office of the Attorney General, Office of Consumer Affairs. So we know what to do. We can advise you on these cases and get you the help that you need. And we are eager to learn about these cases because it helps inform us when we advocate for policy changes with the county. So please let us know also at info@rentersalliance.org. We have folks who speak Spanish, and we can also get folks in any language. If you don't speak English or Spanish or French, we'll find somebody who can speak your language and get you the resources that you need. So that's
go ahead, David. On the let us know tip there. I've noticed people saying if your COVID rent relief case was denied and you think you don't understand why or something, please do let us know about that. But then also for the emergency services that are still available, they take those applications in person as well. I put the email and the phone in the chat there, but if the Germantown office or the Picard Drive in Rockville or the George Avenue, they'll take those in person. And then the last thing is that reminder that Gaithersburg and Rockville and Tacoma Park have their own separate smaller funding, and we can let you know how to apply if you live in the city limits of one of those.
Okay. Any other questions outside of the Arrive thing? Because I will dive into that. Hearing none. Unfortunately, as many of you heard, I think it was a week ago or a week and a half ago, time is becoming blurry. There was a terrible fire at Arrive Silver Spring that displaced scores of tenants, and unfortunately, one tenant lost her life trying to escape. We have organized for some very active tenants who have taken the lead on this, some meetings, and the county has also stepped up to provide resources. There was a resource fair that we attended last Tuesday, not yesterday, but last week, where county resources, food assistance, financial assistance, rehousing assistance was available to you and of course us. We held a meeting on Sunday with Councilmember Kate Stewart and Councilmember Lori Ann Sales and delegates Janelle Wilkins and Lori Charkoudian, as well as a representative from the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs to discuss some of the issues that everybody is facing. Thanks to Malek Demir and my staff, we have managed to translate all of your sign-up sheet information onto an Excel spreadsheet. I spoke to Councilmember Stewart today, who had a conversation with the CEO of Trinity, who had one piece of information that I can share right now, and that is that if you were somehow felt compelled to sign the waiver, that they were backing off the waiver, and that if you wanted to get into your apartment without signing a waiver, you could do so. And that was a commitment, a verbal commitment by the CEO to County Council Member Kate Stewart, who's been on the beat on this issue. We are, as I promised, I will be sending out an email tomorrow to everybody who are on that list. And please share it with anybody else. If we couldn't read the email, we might not have you on the list. But we will send out the letters that we had received from electronically from the Arrive management and any other updates that Councilmember Stewart or any of the elected officials might have regarding the situation over at Arrive, which is a moving situation. There's still decisions that need to be made and more information that we requested in that meeting on Sunday with the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. So we are on it. Stay tuned. You will receive information from us. And we hopefully will see another meeting coordinated with or by County Council Member Kate Stewart, whose heart and soul is in this. So if there's any specific question you have individually about the Arrive thing and you're one of the displaced tenants, you can always email us at info@rentersalliance.org. But I promise you we are on it and we'll communicate something to everybody tomorrow. Anything else? Then let me just quickly remind everybody, Monday, 6 p.m. at the Silver Spring Civic Center will be a very important discussion with county leadership, an expert from the University of Maryland, all of you all with your questions and concerns, and other experts, perhaps landlords, perhaps the Landlords Association, who have opinions about rent stabilization, concerns about rent stabilization, hopes about rent stabilization. We want to make sure we dispel any fantasies about a rent stabilization, either good or bad, and have a general increase in awareness for everyone who's affected, whether you're a renter or not.
Yeah, Matt, we did have a question in the Q&A that I didn't mention but from earlier that basically asked is the anti-rent gouging one, really better than current? And so, yeah, I just want to encourage, like, we can flesh questions like that out, I think, at the event. And it'll be good to bring, especially individual, experiences and things too. So yeah, thanks for those questions.
Right. And again, the anti-rent gouging bill, so-called anti-rent gouging bill, would allow rents to go up 8% plus the consumer price index for urban areas. So that's 8% plus 6.4%. So 8 plus 6 is 14.4. So 14.4%. I'm not a math. My degree was in English, master's in political science, but I can do that math.
Yeah.
And so we're talking 14.4%. And that's double-digit rent increase.
Yeah.
For many
I think
people,
even 3% is too
that's
much.
right. 3% is difficult for some people. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% is a hell of a lot more than people are getting in Social Security increases. But again, it is the principle of the Renters Alliance that we understand both sides of this. If you're a landlord, you got to maintain the profit that you went into the business for and keep up with expenses. And yet, we don't feel that housing is the same thing as beer and cigarettes and fancy shoes. You have a responsibility to community stability and quality housing. So we want to see a balance there. That's our position. We haven't picked a number, but if we had to pick between the two pieces of legislation, we'd be the one that protects renters the most. But we think the discussion is ongoing, and we want everyone to be involved. This is a moment that we have not seen in half a century in this area. And there's a crack in the door where we had a council that was not even considering rent stabilization. Now we have one that agrees that something needs to be done. Now the question is what? So basically the question is to the public, what do you want us to do? And we need to speak up. And we are seeing rent increases in, 16% is high and outrageous, but we're seeing them in 20, 30, and 40% and higher as well. Even though those are not as common, they do exist. And if there is nothing that stabilizes them, there's nothing that requires the landlord to limit that. So keep that in mind. Without those protections, it's the Wild West in terms of housing prices. So I'm going to turn to one of the most articulate board members we have for some final words. Brandy, you want to say something before we go?
Absolutely, yes. And again, just thank you to all of my fellow board members, to our staff, and certainly to Matt for the ways that you all are leading in supporting our communities all across the county, as well as supporting communities across the state, to really make sure that we are bringing these issues to the forefront. As Matt mentioned, when the Renters Alliance was first formed, some of these conversations were considered by the powers that be to be ludicrous conversations. But now we are seeing that through our advocacy efforts over those years, we've moved the needle. We are changing the basis of the conversation. And the way that we do that is not just these 7 people whose videos you are seeing, it is through all of you getting engaged. That's the foundation of the Renters Alliance. That's how we move. That's where our power to shape policy as an organization comes from. And it is also what increases our power to protect ourselves and our families each individually. No one of us or our households is going to be able to make the changes that we need to get more protection. And there are a lot of people who've been making really good comments about the kinds of things that we need to see in Montgomery County. And you're absolutely right. We need these things, and we need to increase the resources that are available for us, for our communities, to make sure that housing is safe and stable and affordable. And so the last thing that I want to do is, in addition to contacting us with those questions, I really do want to encourage you to find the ways that work for you to get engaged, whether it's coming to the forum on Monday and bringing your questions, whether it's continuing to come to these town halls, which we're now about to approach our 3-year anniversary of running these, to make sure that we are getting engagement and that we are bringing together our community, whether it's going to be going to hearings, testifying, or just showing up at hearings to let our council members know that you are there and that this matters to you, or whether it's writing your council members. Each one of us has 5 council members who represent us, 1 district council member and 4 at-large council members. And you get to write to all of them. You also get to write to your state legislators. And if you have any questions about who those folks are, we at the Renters Alliance want to help you out. We want to help make sure that you can make your voices heard. So thank you so much for being here, and please continue to engage with us and to join us in this advocacy, because the more of us there are, the more successful we will be at getting the policy changes that we need.
Thank you, Brandy Brooks. Thank you to my staff, Pat Beckham, Malek Demir, and David Mullins, and of course to our board members, Joshua Fisher, our treasurer, and vice chair, Chris Perry. And to everybody, thanks for joining us. This has been recorded. It'll be on YouTube if you want to watch it again.